Hello to all the visitors, guests and participants of Facyl 2021. My name is Gerfried. I'm the Artistic Director of Electronica, and it's really a great pleasure to be invited to contribute to the program of your wonderful festival and event. I'm taking some time of yours now to talk with you a little bit about how a festival can actually contribute to the transformation of a city. And of course, I will do this in particular with explaining you about how Electronica came into being, how Electronica developed and evolved in all these 42 years since it was invented and created for the first time in 1979. Before we go into this, I actually would like to make a little excursion much deeper into history, because anyway, I think understanding history is always a very good way to also think about the future. And the reason why I'm not with you, but why we are doing this in a digital way is, of course, this terrible pandemic, Corona and the quarantines. And there is this very nice little drawing that has been going around on many social media for a while, and it was pretending to be from the time of the Spanish flu in 1918. But actually it's even older. It goes back to 1910 and doesn't reference to this particular quarantine, but just another big kind of flu, diphtheria, smallpox or other pandemic that was plaguing New York at this time. And it was a very good idea. They thought at this time, the managers of AT&T, that maybe they could use this to advertise the brand new technology, the telephone, and that the quarantine no longer will be such a big problem for our society. We don't have to be isolated because now we have this wonderful invention, the Bell telephone. And they created really wonderful services, so they were promoting it with order by telephone. So you don't have to leave your house, because anyway you are not allowed to, but you could order anything on telephone. And actually it worked quite well, and a lot of people actually took advantage of this, and things were happening like we just recognized them the last 1.5 years with our pandemic. People started to make weddings over telephone and all these curious things that we know. And then I found this interesting photo and I thought, wow, I mean, paranoia or conspiracy theory, did they really believe that the pandemic could be spread out via telephone? So why is this lady while on the telephone wearing a mask? But then when you look a little bit closer, it immediately becomes clear, because she was an employee in one of these connection centers. So of course you remember this maybe from old movies. There were all these young ladies sitting, of course, most likely very lousy paid, like many of the IT jobs nowadays, and they had to connect the people. And of course they didn't get infected via telephone, but they got infected among each other, which led to a very terrible situation, because all of them suddenly caught the disease, and the telephone companies had to go back and say, please, please, please don't use the telephone anymore. We are totally overwhelmed with all these activities. And why do I bring this? I mean, on the first side, of course, it's a very nice anecdote that maybe also with some funny perspectives helps us to deal with the problems of our time. But I think a very clear story here lies in this fact that always new technologies are seen to be something that helps us to cope with our problems. And I think in the same, also unreflected way, in a way that we don't really look too much into the future, into the consequences of applying new technologies. We have been, of course, also now dealing with our Zoom video conferences, with all the digital means that on the one side, of course, helped us to overcome the really very difficult times of lockdowns. But on the other side, I think we have seen that technology can be of service, but it has to be really created and applied in a way that mainly fits the needs of the users. And this, I think, brings us to a very important point again in the history of Ars Electronica and the way why I think art and cultural activities can actually really help not only to transform cities, but can help us to shape our future. And this was the idea of Ars Electronica in 1979, bringing together art, technology, and society. And therefore, of course, I think this is clear when you look at the subtitle, introducing the importance of the human point of view, to think about technological developments not only from the point of view of the engineers, the scientists, the inventors, or the industry who want to make money with it, but really look at the people who are exposed to these developments. And based on these very early ideas, which I will introduce immediately a little bit more in detail, Ars Electronica has been growing into a very interesting, multifaceted organization. We are at the same time, and of course, arts and culture organization, but also an educational organization and also a research and development organization. And I think these three things together in one organization is already a very good hint towards the direction. How can you contribute to change and transformation? Because the most important thing is you have to become a player that can contribute and partake in the process of transformation. Only if you are a driving force, a participant of this transformation yourself, of course, you can contribute. And as I said, this goes back to 1979. And when we look at the first Ars Electronica catalog from 1979, we find these really exciting introductory words. With electronics, a progressive element has come into our world whose influence is not limited to industry and research, but extends to all areas of life. A development has thus been set in motion that opens up astonishing and fantastic aspects, and so on and so on. Sounds somehow very familiar, and I think if only we would change the word electronics with maybe artificial intelligence or virtual reality or some of the buzzwords of our time, I think nobody would even have the idea that this sentence is more than 40 years old. So on the one side, of course, this shows how visionary the guys were in Linz 42 years ago. But on the other side, I think it also shows us that developments are actually not going as fast as we always believe, and that we are constantly running somehow in loops, always into the same troubles and same problems. But of course, technology has been a driving force in so many transformations since then. And let's think again about 1979, because I think it's good to get an idea what was the world that Ars Electronica started to contribute with their transformations. So in 1979 was actually 2 years before the PC was brought to the market, and it was 3 years before the CD player came to the market. And the latest gadget that was really super cool at this time was actually the Walkman that was introduced in 1979. And I think this is a very good indication that actually this period 1979-1980 really marks something like the transformation from an analog into a digital world. And of course you can find many moments in history where you see these transitions. But I'm in this context in particular not so interested when was for the first time some digital device being produced, invented or prototyped, but when did it hit the market? When did digital technology actually start to be the new type of gadget, the new technology that was advertised? And I think this is really this very interesting time. But 1979 is also somehow, I think, a beginning of not only the age of digital and digitization, but also it's the beginning of the age of participation. And of course, I think this itself would be more than one lecture to talk about these new paradigms of the individual becoming more and more important for industry, for consumerism and all these kind of things. But in particular, behind this special cool device, the Sony Walkman, there was a very, again, of course, a marketing machinery. that was putting this device on the market, in particular with this promise that it's the personalization that is important. You yourself now can choose the kind of music that you want to listen when you are on the way, when you are mobile. So the meme of freedom by mobility was connected with the freedom of choice of your music, because you didn't belong or you didn't depend any longer on what the radio people were putting together. You could create your own compilations on your cassette and then play it with this. And a very nice thing also was, when you look at this photo again, you see two people, each of them wearing headphones, listening to the music coming from the same Walkman. So also this idea that you can share your experience. And I think when we in particular think about this sharing and the idea of personalizing, we see, okay, this is exactly what the guys are promising us right now with MP3 and with all the services. In particular, when something like the iPod came to the market, it was promoted with this very special idea that, again, you can decide what you want to listen. But in between, in this period where we arrived right now, it's no longer the Walkman or the iPod that is the dominant idea, where it's really my device, my choice. We are now, of course, in the age of streaming and cloud services, and in the age of a new wonderful promise. Don't think about what music you like. We have the artificial intelligence that takes care of it. And I think in this short little excursion into the history of devices and how devices are marketed, we see a very, very important and dangerous trend. We are going away from this idea of the individual who decides on his or her own to the individual who is being served. And I would rather like to go back to these good old times, because, I mean, I myself also a communication engineer, so I really like to tinker around with toys and devices. And when I see these old guys from 1979, how they were excited to present their technologies at this time. And it's really incredible. I mean, these are images from the first Ars Electronicas, and technology was at a very, very crude level of development compared to all the fancy and glossy possibilities that we have right now. But already here it became clear, and I only can invite you to go to the archives of Ars Electronica to spend hours and hours, nights even, with just going through all these wonderful documents. It became clear that in particular the artistic point of view to the development of technology and its impact to society was a very, very interesting way to go to a deeper understanding. And nowadays we talk a lot of things like art thinking. But I think basically this idea to use art as a way to analyze, understand and incubate a new way of thinking, an insight into this process of transformation between technology and society. This is actually art thinking, and in a certain way we could say it was invented in 1979 in Linz. And what was Linz at this time? Linz was a steel industry city. All the time after World War II, Linz became quite prosperous because it had a very big steel plant. But as you perfectly know as well, the steel industry, all the heavy industry, got into this big troubles, this global recession, and the city of Linz really had to look for a completely new direction. How to develop the city, how to save the wealth, the financial, the economic basis of the city. And of course, Linz was not the only city who had to master this process. And they were doing the very obvious things, of course. They were looking into the future. They were saying, okay, we need to adopt new technologies. We need to innovate the industry. We need to create new jobs. Oops, but how? And of course, they made new support programs to invite companies to settle in the city. They created new departments on the university. But I think what the really special idea was that really helped to shape Linz was that they understood that also culture is an extremely important measurement. It's an extremely important issue to create this transformation, to make sure that you are not only creating an image, but that you create an identity with which people can connect to. And if you want to bring along the people, then you also need to reach out for the people. And I will come back to this with several other examples to kind of exemplify how artistic and cultural projects can do this. And this has been, since then, a very important point of Ars Electronica. Between the Festival for Art, Technology and Society, which is, of course, the element of Ars Electronica that is in particular created and meant to be the source of inspiration from all the artistic contributions every year, to be a moment of connectivity and reach out to the international communities. Between this and the Ars Electronica Future Lab, for example, our research and development department, which I will present a little bit later, we have the Ars Electronica Center. And when the Ars Electronica Center was created in 1996, it was not intended to be now the museum for the wonderful art projects of the festival and of all this digital and computer art that was being developed. But it was from the very first point conceived to be a new way to educate, inform and support the local communities, the people, the schools, the teachers and the pupils, but also, well, also the businessmen. And so the Ars Electronica Center was created as we call it, Museum of the Future, School of the Future, an educational institution that takes its inspiration from the arts and transforms it itself into a new type of educational program. And this is a photo from the festival in 2019, 2 years ago. So this was the year when we had our 40 years anniversary. And you see some, really nice and wonderful thing. And this is not only the many cool art projects that we are showing, but of course, look at the type of people who are coming. And you will see with photos a little bit later on that, of course, or photos like this one, that of course Ars Electronica is fully immersed in this world of technologies, of interesting, experimental, but also provocative artistic projects. But then, suddenly they take place in a Baroque monastery, suddenly they take place in old industrial facilities, and no matter where you look, you don't only see academics or artists or designers, you see the normal people. You see the grandparents coming with their grandchildren. You see that it's a destination for families. And just the way how the festival has been developing, I think, is perfectly described in these very dry numbers of the Ars Electronica Festival 2019. And now imagine the city of Linz has 200,000 inhabitants and the festival has 110,000 visitors. It had 1,500 artists and scientists from 475 cooperating partners who altogether staged almost 550 individual events, 500 exhibits, 2,951 participants booked our guided tours, which is something, again, that brings us back to this very important notion that when you do these events, you have to think from the very beginning on how to really communicate to the audiences. It's, of course, not just enough to think about great programs and wonderful exhibits and lectures and all these kind of things. Maybe start with thinking, how can you communicate this to all your audiences? Another important thing, of course, is go out into the city. 16 different locations throughout the city of Linz. Again, 200,000 inhabitants. Not a big city, 16 locations. And all this in 5 days, well, that's a kind of special thing. And as we all know, then happened Corona. And again, in the middle of pandemic and lockdowns, we had to rethink how can Ars Electronica not only survive as a festival and continue, but what would be, again, a most important and needed service to the communities in the city, but also to our international communities of Ars Electronica. And of course, the most important thing in 2020 was being connected again. And so we started this concept of the Ars Electronica Gardens last year with 120 locations all over the world. This year with 86 gardens that were organized by 188 different organizations all over the world. So a very important point, of course, in terms of how to introduce the impact of a festival into your local community is, again, communication, connection. Connecting people among each other in your city, but in particular when you are not acting and working out of one of the global, metropolises, if you're not in London, Paris, or somewhere in New York and Hong Kong or whatsoever. You need to work hard to create international connections, to create a community of people from all over the world who help you to contribute to this. And this is now two photos from this year's festival. Well, it's not as crowded as it was before, but it's really exciting to see how many people, in particular, of course, local people, immediately took the opportunity again to participate in this year's Ars Electronica Festival. And I'm, of course, in particular showing those photos that look like more, I don't know, like a kind of fiesta where people are just going and having fun and meeting each other. But then again, what more can you achieve with a cultural artistic activity than really being the place where people want to go? But of course, behind this, you need program. You need to introduce new topics, new exciting applications of technology in the creative as well as in the scientific, in the social as well as in the activist scenes and communities. And of course, this is the very core of the Ars Electronica Festival since then. And another thing that I mentioned before, and this is why I'm introducing here very important parts of Ars Electronica, the Future Lab, but also Ars Electronica Solutions, and our international activities like Ars Electronica Export and Ars Electronica Japan, is, as I said, you have to become an active player, a driving force of transformation yourself. And the only way to do this is to go beyond just presenting and communicating. You have to start to produce, you have to start to prototype, you have to start to create facilities and support that you can then in turn also offer again to local talents, whether it's the local artists and creative people, but also maybe supporting with the very special knowledge that you can gain from these projects, support also local industries and companies to better understand how to utilize new technologies for the business. So it's always these two things, or actually three things, which merge into something that we could call skills and competences. So you have to contribute by building up skills and competences, by being educational. You have to contribute by being a very critical analyzer of the developments that are going on, because this is definitely one of the very important things that culture needs to contribute to our society, to be something like the second opinion of developments, the ones that are really looking behind the curtain, that understand also the problems of wrong applications of technology. But with all this critical approach, you also need to use your energy, your creativity, your possibilities to contribute to the creation of new and alternative models. And I think that's why it's became more and more important. Unfortunately, there are many cultural, artistic institutions out there, from artist-run laboratories to the big museums and organizations, who have implemented these programs with laboratories, with artists in residence activities. And again, to produce, to understand, to connect. This is the Ars Electronica Center right in the middle of Linz. And this is probably also a very important point for the success of Ars Electronica, which of course is not so easy to replicate, but our building has been really put right in the center of the city. This is actually just opposite the main square, the city hall. This is right on the Danube River, the beautiful river that runs directly through the city of Linz. Here you see again this ensemble, and having your building, of course, becoming even an icon of the center of the city, but also being a place where this is, for example, an event that was not organized by us Electronica. Our spaces are also very often used by other organizations, sometimes even the church just around the corner makes their ceremonies on the staircase of our Future Lab. And again, all this connection between our artistic, experimental, provocative project, between the prototypes of our Future Lab, the city of Linz and its citizens, goes back into the history. And when I talked about that Ars Electronica was started in 1979 as a festival for art, technology and society. I mean, just imagine, I showed you, this was 2 years before the first PC came to the market, 3 years before the CD player was available in stores. At this time, to go to the citizens of Linz, also to the politicians, and say, okay, well, you know, we want to make a festival for art, technology and society that discusses with international scientists, artists and philosophers of the impact of future technologies to society. I mean, you can imagine how much eyebrows were raised way beyond the usual extensions, just with this very strange proposal and proposition that was made. But the people who invented Ars Electronica were clever enough to understand that it's of course not enough. If you want to do more than just please a small community of experts, you have to create an event that is really able to reach out for the people. And this is when the Linzer Klangwolke, the cloud of sound of Linz, was invented, together with the festival, already as the idea to have on the one side a very advanced discourse about what the future might bring, and on the other side have broad access just to the idea that the future might be actually different than the present and the past. And so this event was created. It was a huge show with music, sound, laser, light effects, fireworks, of course. And in the very first year, when this festival happened, they also had this wonderful idea to collaborate with the local radio station. And the radio station was advertising these events already weeks in advance and asked people and said, you know, Saturday evening, 8 p.m., please tune in to our radio station, open the window, take your radio set, put it in the window and crank up the volume as far as possible. And actually thousands of people did it, not only in the city of Linz, but also in many of the villages surrounding Linz and this whole area. And thus it, of course, really became a cloud of sound that was expanding way beyond just this nice area in the center of the city of Linz. And at the same time, I think it became one of the first really exciting experiments of what social media actually could mean. So even using a totally unidirectional medium like radio to engage people, to make people become active participants of an event. And then again, think this was in 1979. Basically, I think an idea that until now is extremely valuable. So whenever you think about transforming your city, well, of course, it's great, as you see in these photos here, to make spectacular things that get people's attention. But then, of course, what you really need is opportunities to engage people to become participants of your event. And this is a year later, after this was the second Ars Electronica and the second cloud of sound, and they had loudspeakers mounted on helicopters flying above the heads of the people. Loudspeaker stacks were mounted on ships going up and down the river. Again, exciting, spectacular light and laser shows were created. This is Isao Tomita, one of the superstars of synthesizer music in the 1980s, here with his spectacular performance. And this idea has been continuously transformed by Ars Electronica, and again, basically every year we try of new ideas, how actually can we involve people? Not only attract them to consume one of our events, but much more really involve them to be participants. And maybe a little bit later I will have more photos about this wonderful project. This was in 2012 for the Cloud of Sound event, where over a period of several months we had a few thousand people coming to our museum, but also to many other places distributed over the city to create these self-designed letters. And then we equipped these letters with LEDs, with some remote receivers, wireless receivers that allowed to operate the LEDs inside these letters from our central computer. And so we could make thousands of people actually be active participants, not only in this evening show on the banks of the Danube River, but in the preparation already. And of course, this is closely connected to this very important issue again of education, education, education. I think cultural institutions nowadays, I mean, they always, of course, had and they always will have a very strong educational responsibility and purpose as well. But I think in times of rapid change, it's even more important. And one of the ways how Ars Electronica since so many years is actively contributing to the transformation of the city is, of course, reaching out for the children, creating programs that really helps the kids, the pupils, but also students and grown-ups. But I think the young generation, of course, is a very important area here. So we do lots of workshops. We have a special program for kindergarten. We have special programs for primary schools. We have programs for students, but also, for example, for apprentices, which I think is very often an area of the young generation that is a little bit overseen by educational efforts, because you can't reach them so easy anymore when they are not in school. And we also do a very big program for unemployed young people, which I think is extremely important and, I have to tell you, extremely rewarding program. It's just really wonderful to see the immediate response of young people who are very often kind of already put away, put aside and say, they are not motivated, they are just destructive, they are anyway not interested to do something. And then you bring them into the Ars Electronica Center, you give them the opportunity to become creators and to express themselves, and suddenly from one day to the next one, they are super excited, engaged, and actually we have several employees in our company now who came into the company based on these programs. And of course, this is a very important part of the Ars Electronica Center. It's not only the program again, but of course a very important point is the permanence. The big difference between the Ars Electronica Festival and the annual Cloud of Sound that attracted 100,000 people already in the first year. Now with the Ars Electronica Center, or now actually since 26 years also already, 25 years, sorry, 96 was the opening, is of course the permanence. We are here every day, every week. Every day, every week, people can come, visit the Ars Electronica Center, and for example, in our latest exhibition about understanding artificial intelligence, they have really great opportunities to really dive into this world. They have great opportunities to get informed and educated, to discuss their questions, their concerns, their hopes, their visions with our so-called info trainers, which are the people who are on a very high level, can take care of our visitors, who are here to answer questions, but also who are here to conduct discussions with our audiences. We are using cool gadgets, we are introducing new technologies, and again, in all these photos you see it's about people, 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 and of course about art. And the really great thing is, in a certain way, I would say the Ars Electronica Center has been the first, and in some way I think it still is, the only science center that is based on artistic ideas and projects. In the beginning I was always a little bit skeptical to use words like science center for us, because the science center is typically a place where the science and the natural sciences are ruling, and where there's very few space for real creativity and almost no space for art. It's slowly changing in some places, but it still has this kind of image. And I think we really were able to change this by introducing art, the presentation of art projects, but also the involvement of artists themselves into our activities. And this again, I think, in terms of what can be the contribution of a festival, of a cultural institution, to the development of a city, to the transformation, to the ability to transform within a city, is of course bringing people together who usually don't meet very often. Most of our cities, and I'm sure Salamanca has plenty of places where the scientists can really exchange among themselves in a great way. And I'm sure there are plenty of opportunities for the artists community to meet with each other. But how many activities are really there on a permanent basis, where in a totally natural, intuitive form and environment, for example, the scientists and the artists can meet, and where so-called ordinary people, citizens, can also join, and then suddenly they meet artists and scientists, and they meet and they learn about scientific developments as well as they learn about creative ways to understand our world. And I think this makes pretty clear that actually an institution, a cultural institution that wants to contribute to the transformation of the city needs to be a laboratory itself. And since the last renovation of our museum, where we kicked out all the stuff and put in new stuff in all the floors of our museum, we have dedicated a whole floor completely to the idea of being a laboratory. It's actually a multitude of laboratories, 4 or 5 laboratory situations that are very flexible to be used by our info trainers, and our visitors are here together. And at the same time, the laboratory and the people working in this laboratory become also part of the exhibits. And there is a bio lab, there is a citizen lab, and of course, immediately in this nice combination, or also in this kind of crossover of things like biotechnology, genetic engineering on the one side, robotics, electronics and digital technology on the other side, you find an enormous wealth of so inspiring and wonderful art projects. There are so many great artists, designers, architects out there who really have just wonderful projects in terms of how thought-provoking they are, how much they can really give in form of inspiration. And of course, put this together with the possibilities to really work with serious advanced equipment, to work in these workshops with real scientists. That's the way how you really can get people super excited. Another wonderful art project, and I'm really sorry that for the sake of time, I'm not going here to mention all the artists and art teams, art and science teams behind this project, but look at this wonderful project. This is made out of a textile that is created from silkworms who are genetically manipulated to create a silk that is illuminating when you light ultraviolet light on this. So you have all these issues there where you have immediately, you address the questions, the ethical questions, the moral questions of new technologies, but at the same time you address the questions of new forms of production and designs. And I think this is a very important point. In many of these new technologies, whether it's the issues, the ethical, moral issues of genetic engineering, biotechnology, or surveillance technologies, if you really want to educate people, we always need to show them both sides of the story at the same time, and not having places where they get kind of totally overwhelmed with cool marketing language for new technologies, and then again, a completely different place that they might find where they are just kind of impregnated with all the negative things. It really needs to be this discourse and this dialectic situation. And this is, I think, actually what a museum can do by working together with wonderful architects who create nice designs for your exhibition. And again, I can only recommend build your own research laboratory. This is Ali Nikrang, one of our researchers in the Ars Electronica Future Lab. He is a super exciting person because he is a totally artificial intelligence expert coming from the computer science. But before he went into computer science, he also studied composition and piano at the Mozarteum in Salzburg. So he is the perfect example of being an artist, creator, composer, computer science together. And working with him allowed us to go really new directions and reach new heights of installations that really help people to get to know what is actually an artificial intelligence, what is behind it, what is machine learning. And only if you get an idea of how it works, I think you can really again understand why it's so problematic and difficult in many ways. And there are plenty of examples, and when we come to the probably most pressing question of our coming future, the environmental crisis, the climate catastrophe that is looming above our heads, then again, this wonderful project by Davide Quaiola is just an exciting art piece that when you connect it and combine it in an exhibition with examples of how Earth observation from the satellites of the European Space Agency can create insight and data about all this fragile interconnection of our climate and our environment, then you get to this point where people no longer think, oh my God, this is so difficult, I rather just want to think about it, but where they really get also the courage that is necessary to really get into these topics on a new and different and deeper level. And understand that at the very end of this, if we don't take over our responsibility, each of us, not only the politicians or the scientists or the somethings, but we all, only then we will be able to deal with the problems that are ahead of us. And I think, as usual, I have been totally carried away by all the great things to talk about Ars Electronica. I only told you like, I don't know, 30% of all the exciting things that we are doing. But time has been flying as usual. So thank you very much for attention. And if you got a little bit curious about what we are doing, visit us on our websites, or maybe even as soon as you can travel, come to Linz and really see on yourself, for yourself, this wonderful impact that art and culture can have on the development of a city. Thank you very much for your attention.